Hey y'all, hope you're doing well and you are ready to start tackling this last unit of our lecture stuff for 210 and getting ready for the summer or getting ready for 211. Hopefully, I'll see most of you guys, gals, in 211 in the fall. Um, it's really awesome to keep going and just kind of pick up where we left off and just kind of keep that whole family vibe of our classroom going. And so I'm looking forward to finally when we get to sit down and hang out and shake hands and hug each other. Maybe not quite as much like that. We'll see what happens after all of this. But you know what I'm saying. I'm looking forward to getting back a little bit closer to normal with you guys. So hopefully you're doing well. Before you start this presentation, and the presentation for the other chapter, I want you to go look at the lab information first. So I want you to go to that YouTube page that I've been sending you to, Professor 77, and I want you to review his basic spinal cord information. I think he's got 2 labs that he's reviewing for spinal cord up on that channel. So before you watch this chapter 14 presentation, I want you to go look at those, become familiar with the anatomy a little bit, and that's what we're going to do in class as well, before we start the chapter. And so that way you're familiar with some of the terms that we're going to use during this presentation. I am starting with chapter 14 and not chapter 13 because it just makes sense. Most books and most courses present this information. They go from basic nervous, chapter 12, and then usually chapter 13 is the spinal cord, because we build the spinal cord out of the nervous system, and it's easier, it's more basic than the brain. The brain evolved from the spinal cord. And so it's easier to talk about the spinal cord before we talk about the brain. Obviously, it's easier to talk about the basic before you try to talk about the advanced. And so that's the way that I'm going to do this. So it's not quite as confusing for y'all when you're trying to study this. So again, when we're looking at this, don't forget that we left chapter 12 and we're talking about neurons. Neurons are those basic functional units of the nervous system, and the spinal cord is really just a bundle of neurons. Now we're going to have some neuroglia in there holding everything together and doing things, but at the same time I want you to think about it as mainly being just bundles of neurons, and these neurons tend to be doing the same kind of thing or a similar kind of function. They're all carrying the same information. A lot of the neurons may be heading up and down to and from the brain, and so they're either carrying similar sensory information up or they're carrying similar motor information down the spinal cord. And so when we look at this, the spinal cord is a link between the brain and the rest of the body, but the spinal cord can also do its own thing. So without the spinal cord, the brain is somewhat useless because it only has 12 nerves that connect directly to it. So it can't really control everything. So this is really just kind of a super highway to and from the brain. And also, it's going to have its own function. Its own function comes from its gray matter. Anytime we're in the central nervous system, I'm going to keep talking about gray matter versus white matter, and I'm going to keep kind of hammering this for most of the structures that we talk about. Don't forget, gray matter are the cell bodies and synapses, and this is where the true thinking, the processing, and decision making comes from. I want you to realize that the gray matter in the spinal cord doesn't do voluntary thought, it does involuntary, it does unconscious automatic responses. And what that is, we like to call them reflexes. So go ahead and take a note that the spinal cord, it's gray matter, how it functionally is independent is because it can create reflexes. So a reflex, another good definition, is a pre-programmed response. And so if stimulus comes in, this reflex is programmed to always give that specific motor output. So if this stimulus comes in, always do this in response. And so that's really what reflex is. It's not thought about, and it's not really controlled. And I want you to be familiar that most of the spinal cord reflexes have to do more with muscles, not necessarily reflexes of your organs and your more important areas of control. That tends to be more that autonomic kind of control, that unconscious autonomic, and that is another type of reflex, more cranial reflexes. But here, the spinal reflexes mainly focus on muscles and controlling muscles. Like when you go to the doctor, They take a mallet and hit your knee, and then your knee jerks, right? And so that's a good example of one of those muscular reflexes, how you tap certain areas of the body. You can keep tapping your biceps and eventually it will flex, for example. So the white matter, again, we're going to have gray and white. Remember, white matter are the axons of these neurons, and these tend to be bundled together, and these form pathways. Don't forget, they're pathways. And there's two different types of pathways here in the spinal cord. Either we're simply going in and out of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And again, the gray matter in the spinal cord gives us a reflex. So this is going to be very short, just to go into that gray matter and then pop right back out with that motor command. Or what we think more about is up and down to the brain. So the white matter tends to be really more of this elevator of information up and down to the brain. We refer to these bundles of axons that tend to be carrying similar information, sensory going up, ascending, and motor coming down, descending. We tend to call those tracks. So a lot of times, this is how I talk about the spinal cord being that super highway to and from the brain, is that we've got ascending sensory tracks and descending motor tracks that kind of help control everything through those spinal nerves. So again, when we're looking at this spinal cord, it's really just a bundle of neurons. It provides a link between the brain and the rest of the body, but it does have its own functional independence. It can do those reflexes, right? And so this is really simply a superhighway for sensory and motor information. Here we can kind of see some of the basics of the spinal cord. The spinal cord doesn't extend all the way down to your sacrum. It stops around your first lumbar vertebrae. Remember, the first one right underneath your ribs is lumbar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's lumbar 1. And so here we see this point called conus medullaris. Now, the nerves don't stop. We can see it right here that the nerves continue on down into the sacral region and the lumbar region, and we're going to call that the cauda equina or cauda equina, horsetail. It looks like the hair of a horse's tail. And again, conus medullaris and cauda equina. Now, when we look, again, as I mentioned, starts at the brain. It extends from the base of the brain, from the brain stem becomes the spinal cord, and extends down to about L1. And there, off of it, at all of the intervertebral foramen, we're going to have what's important. These branches off of the spinal cord called spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves are what are really going to bring the sensory in and take the motor out. And they're going to be a bundle of both sensory and motor. And so at each of these intervertebral foramen on each side of the spinal cord, we're going to have some of these nerves that come out and they innervate the area around or near, and they kind of control it. They bring the sensory in and they take the motor control out for those regions, especially for muscles, for example. Now, some regions, we're going to get several of these nerves that are going to come out of the spinal cord, and then they're going to weave together, and they're going to create what's called a nerve plexus. So a nerve plexus is an interwoven bundle of nerves. They tend to be going to and coming from the same region, and they tend to control the sensory and motor to that region. So we'll talk about these plexuses. We're going to have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. So we'll see that. Here we can see a view, and they're simply just dividing the spinal cord up into different parts, not too difficult. Cervical, around the cervical vertebrae. Thoracic, around the main thoracic vertebrae. Lumbar, a little bit higher than we talked about. And then sacral is at the very tip, the kind of the conus medullaris, and then we hit the very tip, which is the coccygeal region. Now, again, the cervical region is what leaves the brain, so it's going to become continuous with the medulla oblongata. We'll get into that. We'll talk about the water boy a little bit. So here, the medulla oblongata, that is the lowest component brain stem, and this is basically the first part of the brain that kind of evolved out of the spinal cord. It's just kind of this expanded spinal cord region that's got a lot more specific gray matter dealing especially with our autonomic system. And so cervical connects to the brain, and then thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and eventually then these are going to send out to some of those regions, some of those nerves. Eventually we get to the coccygeal part. One thing I'm going to talk about here in a second is how the coccygeal part there's a lot of elastic in the spinal cord. So if we don't hold the spinal cord down at the bottom, it tends to want to kind of pull up, almost like a broken window shade that wants to rub. And unless, or like old school screens that we used to use projectors on in schools. And so if we pull those down, sometimes they don't want to stick. So sometimes we got to kind of tack them down and make sure that they are not kind of contracting, recoiling inside of the vertebral canal, inside the vertebrae. Speaking of vertebrae, don't forget this is what surrounds the spinal cord, and so the vertebrae kind of protects the spinal cord, but also we're going to learn we got to protect the spinal cord from the vertebrae, because hitting the spinal cord onto the vertebrae can cause a spinal concussion and damage, kind of bruise that spinal cord neurons. Now the vertebrae, the spinal nerves don't necessarily match up directly with the vertebrae, and so that's what this is talking about. I'm not too concerned about where they match up, as long as you realize that these nerves are coming out in those regions. We're going to use kind of the vertebrae nearby to designate that region. As I mentioned, the kind of point at the bottom of the true spinal cord is the conus medullaris, and that stops around L1. And then we're going to have cauda equina. And so tail of the horse, this is going to be all of those spinal nerves that come out below the conus medullaris, all the way down to the sacral region. And one of those kind of components is called the filum terminale, or filum terminalis. And this is really kind of a ligament. And this is that ligament along with what we're going to call the coccygeal ligament. And you can add that to filum terminale plus coccygeal ligament. We'll see that in lab. These are what hold the spinal cord to the coccyx at the very bottom. So this is kind of what I was talking about, kind of holding that window shade from rolling up. So here we can kind of see the conus medullaris. Here we can see that cauda equina, and in the very center is going to be that filum terminale. Here again is another image. You can zoom in on this and you can see cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and then sacral, and then down here is that small coccygeal portion. There are 31 pairs of nerves coming out of the spinal cord. Again, most of these are named after the vertebrae that they're nearest. So we do have 8, not 7 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. We're going to see that a lot of these are going to merge together and form some of those plexuses. So for example, a lot of these lumbar nerves are going to merge together to form the lumbar plexus. Sacral nerves form sacral plexus. We talked about this in the very beginning of our semester whenever we looked at dorsal body cavity, and we saw the membranes, the outer coverings of the dorsal body cavity. And whenever we're looking at that, don't forget that we called the linings of the dorsal cavity the meninges. And so meninges are on both the spinal cord and the brain. And so I know that this says spinal cord meninges, but these are going to become the exact same meninges that are on the brain. So here we're going to see these meninges are those coverings. Don't forget, we started on the outside and we had dura mater. In the middle we had arachnoid, and on the inside we had pia mater. Now we're going to see that inside of a vertebrae, there's a lot more than simply just dura, arachnoid, and pia. Okay, so we're going to have an epidural space. Then we'll have the dura mater. We're not going to miss subdural space. It's a small space, microscopic. And then there's the arachnoid, the spongy layer. It almost acts like a little bit of foam rubber. But inside of the arachnoid and the subarachnoid space is cerebrospinal fluid. So it floats the spinal cord and brain inside of your body and makes it weigh less. So if it hits the bones on the inside of the skull or vertebrae, then it doesn't hit with as much force, doesn't cause as much damage. And then on the inside we have the pia mater. So let's talk about these meninges real quick. First off, the epidural space, and again, this stuff is covered in lab. So if you haven't taken a chance to look at that lab yet, it's definitely worth your time to help you with all this. The epidural space is between the dura mater and the vertebrae. Epidural, outside the dura mater, so that just makes sense. One of the things that I want you to realize is there's a lot of fat here. Whenever we're looking at this, we're going to see a lot of fat that's going to be protection. Remember that that the adipose is going to act like bubble wrap, right? Liquid filled bubble wrap. And so that way, the spinal cord is going to be wrapped up on the outside with some bubble wrap. But also, this area is important because this is where we administer an epidural. So this is where an epidural is actually administered. They're going to puncture into this epidural space towards the bottom of the spinal cord. And there, they're going to add those anesthetics, and it's going to numb that region of the spinal cord down. So really, a very kind of precise procedure to get that epidural in the right spot, because they've only got a certain amount of centimeters and millimeters to hit in order to do that effectively. So they can miss this and hit the spinal cord and cause some damage or various things. The dura mater is next. Dura mater is the outer durable layer. So it's really adding stability and protection to that area. Then we have the arachnoid mater, and the arachnoid mater is called that because it looks like a spider web. So I want you to imagine that this is more of a spongy type layer as well. So this is going to help provide some protection, and inside this arachnoid mater and this pocket inside of arachnoid, between the arachnoid and the pia mater, is where we have the subarachnoid space. And filled in both the arachnoid and the subarachnoid space is the cerebrospinal fluid. Don't forget, we talked about that in chapter 12. Cerebrospinal fluid is super important to keep those neurons in the central nervous system alive, but it's also, it's basically acting like blood for the central nervous system. So here we're going to bathe the outside of the spinal cord, because right below this is the pia mater, and that's really just kind of like one saran wrap layer that adheres to the spinal cord, kind of supports some of those blood vessels. It's a routing center, a routing area for us to put the blood vessels in. And so the subarachnoid space in its cerebrospinal fluid, it's bathing the pia mater, and right inside of that thin layer is the spinal cord. So it's really kind of giving those neurons the nutrients and taking their waste away. Here's what we're seeing. Vertebrae. We got some adipose in the epidural space. Then we start to see some gray layers. The outer gray layer is the dura mater. The next layer is the arachnoid, and here we see this pocket that goes all the way around. That is the subarachnoid space, this more darker region. And then we get to the gray layer, white layer, that's on the spinal cord itself, because here in the center is the true spinal cord. And so there we can kind of see the pia mater. When we look at this spinal cord, I haven't really talked too much about it yet, but here is the gray matter. It kind of looks more brown, and then surrounding it is the white matter. So again, the white matter is either sending info in and out of the gray, or it's heading up and down to the brain. And this gray matter, it's not voluntary thought. This is all unconscious automatic reflexes, right? So this is where the reflexes for a lot of your basic muscle reflexes are stored. As we get into it here, we can kind of see dura, we can see arachnoid, and then we can see pia on the very inside. Again, my picture's a little bit screwy for some reason, but this is page 543, figure 14.3, if you want to take a look, and you can kind of see that. You can also see here how we're going to have one section heading in this way and one section heading in this way. Actually, what's going to happen is this knot. This is going to be our dorsal root ganglia. So this tells us that this is the dorsal root, or the posterior root, and go ahead and put it in your brain that the posterior root, or the dorsal root, is sensory going in. So sensory comes into the spinal cord in the back, and then out the front we see these ventral roots, or anterior roots, and this is motor coming out. So what we've done, we got sensory going in, we got motor coming out. If this is a reflex, sensory goes in, reflex is housed in the gray matter, and then the automatic response comes out the motor. And we're going to bundle both of those together, and right here is our spinal nerve. So once we bundle them together, we're going to create that nerve, and this is actually what goes out in between the vertebrae at those intervertebral foramen. Again, I mentioned that lumbar puncture. This is where you take a sample of CSF for diagnostic reasons. We can't really cut on the brain or the spinal cord to find out what's wrong with it because it's going to kill that tissue. And so as a result, this is one of the only ways that we can get a sample of fluid that's interacting with the cells to kind of see what they're doing and see how they're metabolizing. What chemicals are in the fluid can tell us what metabolism is undergoing with those neurons, and that can tell us if they're normal or not, and maybe what the problem might be. Gray matter. Again, as we look, gray matter is the inner region. I've already kind of pointed it out. This is where we see those cell bodies. We see those synapses. And they say it resembles a letter H. I've always said it kind of looks like a butterfly a little bit. Here they're talking H, but look at that. That looks like a butterfly to me, right? So here's that butterfly. Again, this is towards the back. We can always find the back because the root that goes in has a big bulge on it. It's got ganglia. Remember, this is peripheral, so there's an actual bulging ganglia. And so this is going to be posterior, and this is going to be anterior, and this little part right here is going to be lateral. And so whenever we start to name these things, this is how we're going to see it. Now check it out. Here's what I've been saying. Sensory is going to come in the back, and we can always tell it's sensory because we have this ganglia, this bulge. And so sensory comes in the back, and then motor is going to go out the front. And so here you see that the anterior root or the ventral root is going to carry motor, and the posterior dorsal root is going to carry sensory. In the middle, we have the butterfly, and the butterfly is our gray matter. Now, different neurons are located in different regions to provide function for very specific areas. So we can see right here, and I want you to pay attention because as we go through this in the next couple slides, we're going to use this image, and I'm going to pull this image up at the end after we go through it again just so you can see it as well. But here we see different colors. Pay attention to your colors, and this is kind of showing you that towards the back, we're really focusing on sensory because that's where sensory comes in. And towards the front, we're really focusing on motor because that's where motor goes out. So the sensory information is divided into outside or conscious somatic sensory, and then inside or that automatic visceral sensory, stuff we don't tend to pay attention to. So here's where it's going to process, right? Inside the motor regions, we've got the automatic stuff. A big chunk of it is that automatic, autonomic, visceral region. But they have also where we control our skeletal muscles, the somatic motor area. So each of these wings, each of these horns kind of has a function. It's where we house the neurons, the gray matter for specific kind of things. So again, towards the front, here, and let's point this out one more time. Here we can kind of see the anterior horn. Here we can kind of see the lateral horn a little bit, and back here is that posterior horn. So most of the posterior horn is just dealing with sensory, lateral's dealing with autonomic, and anterior is dealing with somatic motor control. When we look at here, the anterior horn, this has got somatic motor neurons for our skeletal muscles. And then the lateral horns out to the side, these are going to house autonomic motor neurons. And so this is where all of our guts are being controlled, is through a lot of those regions. And then the posterior horn, or the dorsal gray horns, are where we're going to have sensory for both somatic and motor. Excuse me, sensory for both somatic and visceral. Sorry about that. Now, in the middle, the body of the butterfly, what connects the two wings together is called the gray commissure. And in the middle of the gray commissure is a little hole called the central canal. I'm going to back up to that picture real quick. Here we can kind of see is the gray commissure. This is the body of the butterfly. This is what connects the two hemispheres, the two spinal hemispheres. And in the center is that central canal. That central canal is a place, I've already mentioned that around the side of the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space is where we're going to have some of that cerebrospinal fluid. But also in that little hole, in that little central canal region, we're going to have some cerebrospinal fluid as well. So that central canal is going to become continuous with some of the hollow regions inside the brain. We're going to call those ventricles. So you may want to go ahead and make a note that the central canal becomes the fourth ventricle once it hits the brain. Okay, and we'll see that. I'll point it out to you. And again, this is just carrying that CSF to keep those tissues alive. Now, the white matter in the spinal cord, again, I've kind of given you the basics. Here's a little bit more advanced. White matter, again, it's either going in or out to the gray matter, but more than likely it's going up and down to the brain. And so whenever we talk about that, we're going to talk about this as far as anatomically, we're going to call them columns. We still like to call them columns in our lab. This textbook, they call them funiculus or funicula. If you're familiar with that term, if you ever go to Europe, in many of their cities that have a lot of hills, and again, public transportation is a lot more common there than here in America. People don't own cars in Europe. They kind of ride different forms of public transportation. One of the forms of public transportation is a trolley that takes you up and down the steepest hills in a city. They call those trolleys that just go up and down the steep hills funicula. They may only be a quarter mile long. They take you up the biggest hill so you don't have to walk it, and you just pay like €1 or something and it takes you up. And so here they're using the same term for the trolley that takes people up and down hills as the same thing that takes information up and down the spinal cord. So that's not too bad of a term. Columns, I like that. If you slice it open, they look like columns. They literally are heading up and down, and so they appear like columns out in front of some Greek architecture. Now, these white matters are sending information up and down, and we call bundles of these neurons, bundles of these axons that are carrying similar information, we call them tracks. You can also use that term fascicula, which is talking about a fascicle. Again, you can call them a fascicle, but I tend to call them tracks. So functionally, we talk about tracks, and anatomically, we talk about columns or funiculus. Okay. Now, here we've got some that surround the posterior gray horns, and we call those the posterior columns, posterior white columns, or posterior funiculus. The lateral white columns or lateral white funiculus is going to be on the side, out beside the lateral gray horn. And the same thing with the anterior. This is going to be towards the front of that anterior gray horn. If we look here, we can see the horns being pointed out, and on the other side, we can see the columns being pointed out. So the white matter that surrounds the horns just has a similar term, except for they're called either the columns or funiculus. Okay, and again, this is taking information up and down to and from the brain. I started to already mention this, that whenever we look at the spinal cord, what branches out of the spinal cord is actually, there's a branch going in the front and going in the back, and actually going in the back and coming out the front is a better for it. The component that is coming out of the front of the spinal cord itself called the anterior or the ventral root. And so the anterior or the ventral root, and I've already mentioned this, and you need to make sure that you know this, is motor out. So the anterior root takes the motor information out, and the posterior root or the dorsal root takes sensory in. Okay, so sensory comes in the back and motor goes out the front. Again, if we're looking at a picture, they always give us this bulge called the posterior, or I prefer to call it the dorsal root ganglion. And so this root ganglion is just the bulge, and it's at the base of the posterior or dorsal root, and it kind of helps us to see which one is that dorsal root. Now, once these come out of the spinal cord and they move away far enough that they can start to bundle together, they do bundle together. And where they bundle together, they unite and they move through the intervertebral foramen, and now we call it a spinal nerve. So again, I've kind of mentioned this here. We can see is the spinal nerve. There's the intervertebral foramen. This is a thoracic vertebrae that we're looking at. We can see that big long giraffe nose right there. And so here we can kind of see towards the front, we're going to have the ventral root or anterior root. Towards the back, we're going to have the posterior root. To justify that, there's the bulge. So there is the dorsal root ganglia. So there's the dorsal root bringing sensory in. And then here is that motor information heading out. Bundle them together, and we create the spinal nerve. Now we can see here the spinal nerve is going to branch. Some of it's going to head back to control things behind the spine, the spinal cord, most of it's going to head forward and control things towards the front. One little component right here that I want to pay attention to is going to come out and hit these little ganglia that are right beside the vertebrae. And this is going to be called our sympathetic trunk or our sympathetic chain. There's your actual sympathetic nervous system, are these ganglia, these little knots that are right beside your vertebral bodies. Again, here we see the anatomy. We see the horns, anterior, lateral, posterior horn, and we see posterior white columns. We see lateral white columns. We see anterior white columns or funiculus. Also see this posterior root with its ganglia bringing sensory in, and then we see this ventral root taking motor out. Again, when we bundle those together, after they reach out far enough to bundle, then we call it the spinal nerve at that point. And here's those functional regions of the gray matter as well in each of those horns. So a lot of good information there that you need to definitely be aware of. And if this is a reflex, the sensory is going to come in, and there's these interneurons right here already know the answer to that sensory question. And so they're going to go ahead and they're going to send that answer out on this ventral root. So there's no need to jump out of the gray matter and into this white matter to go all the way up to the brain. If the spinal cord can house that reflex, then the sensory comes in and it goes right back out. And then if we access this white matter that's surrounding it, then we tend to be going up and down to the brain. And that's going to be a much more advanced type of movement. That's going to be more voluntary control of muscles, for example, or more visceral control of some of those organs. Now, let's mention these nerve plexuses real quick. This is going to go fairly quick. The nerve plexuses, again, are interwoven groups of nerves as they leave the spinal cord. The first one's really not a nerve plexus, but let's mention the intercostal nerves. These are going out in between all of your ribs. These tend to want to control a lot of the motor around that region. So here we can see those intercostal nerves. There's a rib. So they're just kind of pointing out that they're in between the ribs. Then we have the cervical plexus. Obviously, the cervical plexus is going to come down from that cervical region. Here, I want to give you a picture real quick here. Sorry. Here you can see the yellow roots of the cervical plexus on that cadaver. So it can show us what it's really controlling. And here's the important thing is cervical plexus is going to control your neck muscles, skin of your neck, and portions of the head and the shoulders. Now, what a lot of this is important for is posture. Okay, so a lot of this is important for your posture. One other thing that this is going to control is going to be your phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve controls your diaphragm. I definitely want you to know that. The phrenic nerve is the main nerve that's formed from the cervical plexus. After it all comes together and meshes, it makes this nerve, and this heads down to the diaphragm. If this nerve is randomly firing, then it's going to cause your diaphragm to spasm, and that's what we call hiccups, right? So here again, we can kind of see that phrenic nerve trailing down from part of that plexus. Now, here's another good view that shows us atlas and axis, so we can see how high up we are, especially with reference over here, and we can see these nerves coming out. And then there's that phrenic nerve being formed. The next plexus is the brachial plexus. This is obviously going to come out in near the arm. Brachial refers to upper arm. And so this is lower than the cervical. And here, let me grab you a picture. Here we can see that lower than cervical. This comes out in bundles and it goes all the way out into the arm. And so brachial plexus is mainly controlling your arm in general. So supplying upper limb and the pectoral girdle, so arm and shoulder, right? That's really what we're focusing on. Here we can kind of see that, and then here we can see all of the branches and how it gets very detailed, okay? So we can head all the way down to the arm, and I want to show you this one. This one's better. So you can see over here the spinal cord, and then you can see how it comes out, goes through the shoulder region, and all the way down the arm to the fingertips. Lumbar plexus is obviously going to come out in that lumbar region located near our psoas major muscle, right, our filet mignon. And so it's important that you realize that the lumbar plexus is going to come out and it's going to form what we call a femoral nerve. Now, femoral, you know that, that's the femur, so that's in your thigh. So I want you to realize that this joker is not going to control all of the leg. It's mainly dealing with thigh muscles, for example. Okay, so it supplies the anterior thigh muscles in the sartorius, and it brings in information from the thigh and the middle of the leg. And so this is not necessarily the entire leg, this is really just more of the thigh region. Again, let's take a look down here in the internal part of that abdominopelvic cavity. We can see psoas major would be running right along those vertebrae. You can even see iliacus right there beside it. So there is that femoral nerve, and we can see up above it all that lumbar plexus that forms it. Again, here's another view. And here's a better view kind of showing us how it goes down into the leg. It does deal with some of that saphenous nerve towards the medial, but if you notice, most all of this stops in the thigh region. What's really going to focus on this lower leg and a little bit more leg overall is going to be coming from the sacral plexus. So the sacral plexus is below the lumbar plexus. You can see here gluteal, pelvis, perineum, posterior thigh, almost all leg and foot. So the sacral plexus is going to do a lot more. It's deeper down here. We can see right there's the sacrum, and so here's that plexus coming out, and it's going to form that sciatic nerve, and we can see here is that sciatic nerve running down. Up here would be our gluteal region, and so there is the medial lateral thigh, excuse me. Sciatic nerve, largest, longest nerve in the body, and so this is a big nerve. It projects through the pelvis, through that greater sciatic notch, and so that's where that gets its term, and it's going to head all the way down into the lower leg, and we've kind of seen that already in some of those views. Here again, we can kind of see how lumbar and sacral are going to merge together a little bit to help whenever we're kind of controlling the leg overall. Here again is that big bundle. There is that giant sciatic nerve. We notice that it doesn't branch quite as much up here, but then it starts to radiate towards the lower leg especially. So it's doing a little bit more of the leg region compared to the lumbar. Sciatica, so you may have heard of this. This is problems with the sciatic nerve. You're going to have pain possibly. You're going to have lack of sensation maybe. You're going to have difficulty controlling. And so sciatica, this is could be due to a herniated disc that's kind of bulging onto that nerve, compressing it. But no matter what, we've either got damage or we've got compression on that nerve, and that nerve does not like it. So it's telling you that in that form of pain. Again, we've already looked at these spinal nerves a little bit. And so the spinal cord has got that major link. This is just that first slide one more time. Not sure why they threw it up there, but here is that image that we've already seen several times. So definitely make sure that you're familiar with this. This is our spinal cord in a nutshell whenever we look at it. Now, to start getting to some of the last kind of information, we've still got 25, 30 slides, but this information starts to go a lot faster. It's a little bit independent of what we've already talked about. This is, how we get towards that last day of information for each chapter. It tends to kind of be the hodgepodge, the leftover stuff. So let's start with dermatomes, okay? And this does have to do with the spinal nerves. So dermatomes, these are specific regions of skin supplied by a spinal nerve. So in other words, what this is a way to take the human body and to turn it into a map of which nerves control which areas of the body. Here's the anterior and here's the posterior. So we can see that. So a lot of times we see a definition that says something about specific bilateral regions of skin surface monitored by spinal nerves. So especially if you see something like that, specific bilateral regions of skin surface monitored by spinal nerves, well then that's what a dermatome is. What dermatomes can do though, dermatomes can be very helpful when we're trying to determine damage to the spinal cord, right? So whenever we're trying to determine damage to the spinal cord, well then, or which nerve might be affected in a disease is another thing we can use it for. Then, for example, if you are losing sensation in your neck, right, and this upper shoulders, lower neck region, so you may have been in a car wreck not too long ago, and your head whipped forward. You didn't officially have whiplash, but you had a headache and you had some neck problems. You could have damaged this spinal cord in these regions, or you may be compressing on these nerves now. And so with that tingling sensation or numbness or lack of ability to move those muscles, well, that tells you right here's where the damage is. Okay, so shingles, for example, likes to follow these dermatomes. Shingles is a nervous disorder, so it tends to follow these dermatomes. So you can actually see where the shingles, which nerve it's affecting, based on where you see the rash that the shingles causes. That kind of that you know bubbly looking rash, no fun. But we can I had a colleague who had on her thumb and on the side of her arm, and so I knew, we both knew that there was C6, right? That's where she was having issues with that shingles. Okay, so again, dermatomes can indicate damage to one or more spinal nerves. So we're going to use this clinically to determine where damage might be. Okay, let's see. Shingles, there, I've just talked about it, and how shingles likes to react on just one of these nerves, and so it kind of follows these nerves up. Again, this is a reactivation of chickenpox. Virus remains latent in the dorsal root ganglia for the rest of your life, basically, and so it's reactivated, and it starts to travel through the nerve, and it starts to cause that blistering and that rash along that dermatome, right? Burning, tingling, pain. So this is definitely a nervous disorder. Whenever we look at these pathways, I've already started to mention this as well, that the white matter is really these pathways heading up and down to and from the brain. We've got sensory pathways that we call ascending pathways. Then we've got motor pathways that we call descending pathways. And that just makes sense. If we're heading up to the brain, well, we're taking information to it, so we're sensory. And if we're heading back down from the brain, then we're taking its command out, and that is that motor pathway. So ascending is sensory, descending is motor. Here we see a lady singing into a spoon, right? So kind of looks crazy, but it looks like, oh, she's singing in this spoon and I just burned my finger. So what this is really kind of trying to show us are these pathways, and this may actually be more of a reflex that's just housed inside of the spinal cord. But this shows the sensory pathway coming in, and then that reflex is determined, and so there's that motor pathway coming right back out to move that muscle. So again, this is going to come in on that brachial, head up the spinal cord is what this is trying to show, and then back down. Okay. Now, whenever we look at this, many times as information goes up and down the body, it may switch sides. So, for example, you may have heard that the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. Well, that's called a contralateral control, a contralateral pathway. It controls the opposite side of the body. If the if that portion controls the same side of the body, then we call it ipsilateral nerve or ipsilateral control. So many times you may hear contralateral versus ipsilateral nerves. I'm not really that concerned about this concept, but realize what they mean because that could show up on the test. Contralateral just means to the opposite side. Ipsilateral means on the same side. Now, I'm also not that concerned that you know the series of 2 or 3 neurons. They are really concerned that you know where the primary, secondary, and tertiary neurons are in the sensory pathway, and you know where the upper and lowers are located in the motor pathway. I'm not concerned with that, and I'm going to erase any questions for that off of the test because this is just a big pain in the butt. Okay. Now, sensory pathways, these are ascending. Well, it just makes sense. We've got 2 types of sensory. We've got somatic sensory and we've got visceral sensory, sensory from our organs and sensory from basically everywhere else. And so somatosensory is one of the ascending pathways that takes that cognizant, that conscious information and takes it up to the brain. And viscerosensory takes that visceral, the organ information up to the brain. Okay, I don't really care too much beyond that. Motor pathways, descending pathways are taking this information down. And again, what we really should be dividing this into a little bit more, instead of worrying about its anatomy, is worrying about its physiology. You know, we can divide the motor pathways into somatomotor or visceral motor as well. And so we can control skeletal muscles, or we can control our organs, right? And so descending pathways, and again, don't worry about upper versus lower motor neuron. That's nothing that I really care about. Now, to start wrapping this information up for this chapter, let's start talking about reflexes. Again, a reflex, it is a pre-programmed response. It is rapid and it is involuntary, right? So that's the point. It's pre-programmed. We don't think about it. It's an automatic response that's already housed in the spinal cord or our brain. If we ever see a certain stimulus, then we're always going to give a certain response, right? So specific sensory in always equals specific motor out. So no need to even think about it. And so, again, a good one would be touching a hot stove and jerking that hand back, right? So definitely important for survival. And as we've mentioned, that's one of the main key characteristics of this nervous system compared to the in system. So when we look at this, again, it's rapid, it's pre-programmed, and it's involuntary. And so those are three key features to what a reflex really is. But the key is that we don't think about it and that it's already done for us, right? So this is the same as our basic nervous response, though, right? And so we're going to have the same 5 steps coming up. We're going to start at a receptor. We're going to send that info to the CNS, and then we're going to end at an effector, right? And so this is the basic wiring, and this is what we've already seen. Step 1, stimulus, right? It's going to activate that receptor, that specialized cell that can detect that stimulus. Send that in through the sensory pathway, sensory neurons, until we hit the CNS. Here, if we're talking about a spinal reflex, then we're talking about how the CNS, we stop in the spinal cord. We're not going up and down those tracks to and from the brain. We're just staying here. The interneurons there in the CNS determine the response. It takes the sensory in, determines that response, and then it sends that response out on the motor neuron. So the motor neuron sends that signal out to the effector, that AP out to the effector, and the effector, don't forget, usually a muscle or a gland, they are going to then make that change. And so here, the example is going to be stepping on a nail. So you step on a nail, that stimulates the receptor for pain, and then that sensory information goes into the spinal cord. Here we see just one interneuron that's going to have the information. If you ever step on something sharp, always pull your foot back, right? Or here they're talking about your hand. You touched a tack, you touched a nail, right? And so here is the information in the CNS where that's housed. If hand touches nail, always pull hand back. And so it sends that information out. You have touched a nail, so now hand needs to pull back. And so now we're going to trigger that effector, that muscle, to pull the arm away, pull the hand away from that negative structure, from that pain. Again, ipsilateral versus contralateral. So on the same side versus on the opposite side, right? And so some of these are on the same side and some of these are on the opposite side. So one way that we can group these reflexes is based on, is it ipsilateral or contralateral? A lot of times we prefer to group them this way, though: monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. So this isn't that difficult. Monosynaptic means there's only one synapse. So that means that the sensory neuron directly synapses to the motor neuron. So there's never even an interneuron involved, okay? A patellar reflex is an example of that. That's the one where you tap the mallet on your knee and then it kicks. Polysynaptic are more complex, and here we're going to have an interneuron in between. So if we do have an interneuron, then it is a polysynaptic reflex. So here's just an example. Here's monosynaptic, and so here's the sensory coming in blue, and it directly synapses to the motor that goes right back out. So there's nothing in between. And then here we can kind of see how there's sensory going in, but here's our interneuron, and then we have the motor going out. So here's a polysynaptic, right? So that's really the only difference, is just if we've got an interneuron or if we don't. Right. Here's some of our specific receptors that I should be familiar with. So a stretch receptor. Okay, stretch receptor, this is what's really paying attention to the length of a muscle. If it stretches too far, it's going to try to contract pretty much to relieve that stress, to make sure that we don't mess that muscle up. So this is a type of a monosynaptic reflex. A couple of different things involved here, and we can see a couple of these. Here's that muscle spindle. So we've got a muscle spindle that's really monitoring that muscle. And the muscle spindle is stretched, and it's going to trigger the reflex. So if the muscle spindle's stretched, it can do it by the entire muscle being stretched too far, or if only a portion stretches too far. And then it's going to contract to resist that stretch. We don't want to stretch it too far and rip that muscle off the bone or break a bone, for example. And so it's going to kind of do the opposite. Instead of stretching, it's going to contract a little bit. Biceps is another type of this, a specific type of this, where you can keep tapping on the biceps, and eventually the biceps will contract, your elbow will contract. Okay. Now, the Golgi tendon reflex, I want you to be familiar with this, but this isn't too tough. Golgi tendon, this is monitoring a tendon, right? So this is monitoring a tendon, and again, this is due it lengthening too much, and so this is going to help with those stretch reflexes, prevents the muscle from contracting excessively. So it's kind of the opposite, to make sure that it does force lengthening. Sorry, I kind of mentioned that backwards. I'm sorry. So the Golgi tendon reflex is really going to cause lengthening, not shortening, not like the stretch reflex. And so here we're contracting too much. Instead of playing arm wrestling and contract so much that you break your arm bone, then the muscle needs to naturally lengthen a little bit, and that's when that other person wins, right? And so then the muscle lengthens, and it allows the tension to be released so it doesn't snap anything. Don't worry about this reflex path, but the whole key is to protect the muscle and tendon from excessive damage. Withdrawal reflex. This is always one of the best. Withdrawal from anything painful. So it can be a sound, it can be a sight, it can be a smell, it can be a touch. So anything that's painful, that is negative, we withdraw from it, you know? And so the withdrawal reflex is a polysynaptic reflex, and it just is involved with withdrawing away from an unpleasant stimulus overall. Crossed extensor reflex is pretty cool. I want you to stand up if you can. If you're listening to me and you can stand up, stand up. Go ahead and stand up. Now, put your feet about shoulder width apart and center your weight over both of those feet, right? Now, lift the foot up. What happens? You want to start to fall over, right? But if you stand upright and you lift your foot up, then instead of falling over, you actually balance on your other foot. This is called the crossed extensor reflex. If you pull one foot away, if you lift one foot up, then the extensor in the other foot is going to contract, and it's going to try to keep your balance. So again, here's one of those contralateral type of reflexes. We're actually changing what happens on one side, but it's affecting the other side. So here, step on a sharp object with your right foot. The crossed extensor reflex stimulates the left quad to contract to keep you standing upright, right? So that's kind of cool. How can we balance on one foot? It's a crossed extensor reflex. It's really a little complicated. That's the reason babies can't do it that well, right? So you got to develop some of these as the neurons in the brain finishes its development. Here it's kind of showing you that, but again, because we've got issues with this picture, I sincerely apologize. You can look that up in the textbook. So again, these reflexes and variations in these reflexes, these are important for diagnostic. So that's the reason that we test these in a doctor's office. That's why there's that mallet and that kick with the knee. So test specific muscle groups and spinal nerves is what we're really thinking. Are those nerves going in and out, and are they functioning properly, right? And so that's important, and that's one reason that they're going to do these tests. So if there's some variation is normal, but if you've always got this consistent abnormality, then that's an indication that something's wrong inside of the system. So it could be a hypo or a hyperactive type of reflex. These are some of those variations. So hypoactive is where it's not quite as reflexive as it could be. The reflex is diminished or it's absent. So again, this is indication that there's damage, maybe to the muscle, maybe it's to the spinal cord, maybe to the connection. Hyperactive means that it's too active, right? So again, this could indicate brain damage, possibly spinal cord damage. And that's where we're going to finish this up. Okay, that's our last slide in this presentation. That is the spinal cord. Again, it functions independently for reflexes. Here we've just talked about a lot of these reflexes. And overall, gray matter and white matter is really kind of what we're focusing on to get these reflexes to take place. And then we've also got that white matter dealing with up and down to the brain. All right, if you have any questions, email me. Otherwise, have a great day.